Joining us is Alex Shephard, reporter from the New Republic. And Alex, it really does look like the whole Russian campaign is, well, if not falling apart, it's very much teetering at the moment.
I think a few weeks ago, after Putin launched unexpectedly a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the thought was that Kyiv could fall within weeks. And yet, what we've seen now is this rapid redeployment back towards Ukraine's eastern border. Now, this does not mean that Russia is necessarily pulling troops out. Instead, they seem to just be redeployed. So the situation in places like Mariupol is expected to get significantly worse as Russia tries to amp up pressure on Ukraine, but also the West to extract various concessions. And yet what we are seeing, I think, is the clearest sign yet that both the sort of economic pressure that's being put on Russia at the moment, but also Russia's own military strategy in Ukraine is failing, and that the intelligence perhaps that they came in with was incorrect. I think we're also seeing increasing reports that it's a war that's being waged, by Putin and his advisors who are, hundreds of miles away from where the center of the action is. And I think Ukraine has, put up a surprising and remarkable fight, and thus far, it's been a vindication of their ability to withstand Russian pressure.
Although most things that come out of Moscow contain a certain amount of murkiness, there's more being said about Vladimir Putin's health, whether or not he's got cancer, whether he has early signs of Parkinson's.
There's been some speculation about Parkinson's for quite some time. There's been recent reporting, too, about a doctor that specializes in thyroid cancer following him around everywhere. But I think what these reports highlight are really two things. One is Putin's own sort of obsessive concern about his own health, which has increased over the last 2 to 3 years, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic. I think, but also they really show how little we understand about Vladimir Putin at this moment. I think this was someone who I think intelligence agencies, but also Western diplomats felt like they had a read on until the last few years, and yet now we've really been completely cut off to understanding how he works, and he also seems to be increasingly cut off from, understanding the way that the world works around him. I think this has sort of all come to a head in the situation in Ukraine. Now, whether or not he's ill is another question, but I do think what these reports highlight is just how shadowy a figure he's become over the last 2 or 3 years.
As Donald Trump, the former president of the US, spooks about getting a hole in one, lots of people are looking at him and saying he emboldened Russia to do what they have done. And some of his comments recently labelled absolutely scandalous.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange thing because the former president actually receives fairly scant media attention in the U.S., partly by virtue of the fact that he is no longer on Twitter. But recently he was asking essentially for Putin and other Russian oligarchs to release information that they may have about Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son's business dealings in Ukraine. Donald Trump is still convinced that this is going to be a sort of momentous scandal. It was more or less buried during the 2020 election. Whether or not it emerges again is another question. And yet what this shows is his continued insistence that what matters most is his own political standing, that he will essentially do anything, in this case, throw the people of Ukraine under the bus for the smallest political advantage. I think it's a really remarkable and shocking scandal, but it also points to a larger weakness as we head into the midterm elections, which is that over the last 4 years, even as Russian aggression has continued to increase, culminating in the invasion of Ukraine, what we've seen is growing softness on the right towards Russia, particularly from Donald Trump himself. And now, even when he's not, as you say, grousing or sort of boasting about getting a hole in one, all he's doing is harping on about the fact that he claims, even though it wasn't the 2020 election was stolen from him, but also that he's not condemning Putin's imperialistic and autocratic, invasion of Ukraine. He's begging him for help in the next presidential election. It's shameful.
It's interesting watching the media conference last week where President Joe Biden was. You got a real sort of indication of where the Europeans were on the whole idea of Donald Trump, basically asking the president, saying there's no chance, is there, that this guy's going to run again?
And it's an interesting thing to think about as well, because what we've seen, particularly over the last 6 to 8 weeks, is a remarkable, NATO has almost come back from the dead after Donald Trump had really done as much as he could to damage the organization over the previous 4 years. And really, it's come together, in some ways much stronger than ever. We're seeing a very rapid decision by Germany to boost its own military spending, something that obviously hasn't happened in quite a long time. I think the alliance is itself stronger than it's been in years, maybe since the invasion of Iraq. And that has, I think, changed the international calculus. Now, I think also European leaders are wary of Donald Trump reemerging because he's obviously a huge NATO skeptic. But what we have seen is a transition, I think, to a much stronger NATO, and I think one that will be able to withstand the sort of saber rattling, or at least the threats from Donald Trump to leave the organization unless members, quote unquote, paid up for American protection.
And when you look through the haze and quieten your ears to the white noise, it really does look like Joe Biden has handled this situation particularly well.
I think I'm talking to some people, around the sort of foreign policy establishment. I think the consensus is largely that this is a president who's handled this better than maybe any other president in recent memory could. Certainly the most recent one, but he has actually managed, I think, the right balance of essentially raising pressure on Russia, but also building alliances, making sure that the United States was not ever out in front of its allies in Europe. And also, I think what we've seen, and which he hasn't frankly gotten enough credit for, is an effort to create off-ramps for Russia, to create potentials for this invasion to end, peacefully. And I think that's I think the thing that he deserves the most credit for. Now, it still is being buried in the U.S. Polling does not reflect, I think, that people think necessarily that he's doing a great job. But I think the consensus within experts in the field is that this is really, extraordinary work from the president.
And the other thing is, and people are cruel, and reporting is cruel, and of course, politics is probably the cruelest game of all. But Joe Biden, when it comes to his speech, he's had let's not deny, he's had a stutter since he was a boy.
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing that he's worked on for many years. He's talked about it in a very moving fashion. But I think what we've also seen, I think, especially in that speech that he gave in Warsaw last week, which, in my opinion, was the strongest of his presidency so far, we've seen is his ability to sort of take the mantle of leadership on the global stage in a way that brings allies with him. It's not getting in front of where the international consensus is at the moment. I think he did that briefly. There's a sort of gaffe where he seemed to have called on regime change in Russia, although that was quickly walked back by the administration. But in general, what you've seen at the same time is sort of boosting NATO as a way of putting pressure on Russia without making this about the United States, which is, I think, one of the big challenges here. And I think there's a political temptation specifically for Biden himself, because right now this is a president who is struggling domestically. His poll numbers are as low as they've been throughout his presidency, and yet he's consistently sort of put his own political profile in the back seat as he's sort of boosted NATO and put pressure on Russia, and spoken very powerfully, I think, about the importance of democratic institutions in fighting autocrats like Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, a political gaffe maybe, but it was what most of us think, to be honest. Alex Shephard, it is always good to chat with you.
Thank you.